Good evening and a very warm welcome on behalf of Milim to this evening's presentation in the company of the author Menachem Kaiser. Welcome to our live audience here at the UHC in Leeds, and welcome to those of you watching at home in Leeds, in the UK and all around the world. My name is Jonathan Straight and I'll be chatting with Menachem, whom I'll introduce in just a moment. Your questions are very welcome. For those of you at home, please type whatever you'd like to ask into the Q&A facility on your screen. Those in our live audience can of course ask questions in the usual manner, and as ever we'll try to get through as many of your questions as possible. Again, for those at home, let me draw your attention to the chat facility on your screen. This allows you to send a message to all of the other participants on this webinar should you wish to do so. And finally, this event is being recorded and will appear on the Milim website at milim.org.uk in the next few days. There you can find recordings of other past events as well as details of our future programme for which you can book tickets. And so to our guest this evening. Menachem Kaiser holds a Master of Fine Arts qualification in creative writing from the University of Michigan and was a Fulbright Fellow in Lithuania. His writing has appeared in The New Yorker, The Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic and elsewhere. He lives in Brooklyn, New York, and was a guest recently at Jewish Book Week in London. His recently published book is Plunder, and that's what we're going to be chatting about this evening. Menachem, a very warm Milim welcome to you. Welcome to Leeds. I imagine most of our audience haven't read your book. So in a nutshell, what's it about?
First, thank you so much for inviting me. It's my first time in Leeds. It's such a pleasure to be here. The book is about, very briefly, it follows kind of two strands. And one strand is my ongoing attempt to reclaim ancestral property that belonged to my grandfather, whom I did not know. And so sort of entering into that maze, and so there's certain legal challenges, sort of the main one being, it's gonna be a long story, but to put it briefly, proving that my ancestors, the relatives who died in the Holocaust were in fact dead. And so I had to go through the whole court system, finding out what I needed to find out, filing the right papers, actually testifying in court about the death of my dead relatives. And then the other strand of the book, again, it's a little bit of a long story, but to put it briefly, is finding out that I had an unknown family member who also survived the Holocaust, who turned out to be my grandfather's closest surviving relative. And this man, named Menachem Kaiser, was in fact a major celebrity among a band of Nazi treasure hunters. And I, in turn, became a really big deal among the treasure hunter community. So the book kind of follows those two paths: my descent into the treasure hunter community and the attempt at property reclamation.
So let's explore these themes in a bit more detail. So how did you discover there was a family property in Poland? And I suppose what made you try to claim ownership of it?
Sure. So my grandfather, I didn't know him growing up. He died before I was born, so I didn't have any sort of relationship with him. But beyond that, I also didn't know really all that much about him. He was sort of a distant figure. I didn't really have any sense of who he was, of his persona, of his person. It's just like nothing really was passed down that felt tangible or real or textured. And so I never really felt all that curious to go to Poland, to be honest. It wasn't something that I felt like an urge to go explore those roots. I grew up as three of my four grandparents are Holocaust survivors, and it was a big part of our Jewish identity, but it wasn't like there was no compulsion to sort of go back to Poland or Czechoslovakia to sort of see where we came from. In 2010, I got a Fulbright Fellowship and moved to Lithuania, again, not doing anything with family, really on sort of unrelated research. But while I was there, I ended up meeting a guy whose father was the chief rabbi of Galicia, which is a region that does not exist, but yet it has a chief rabbi. And he invited me to come to Krakow for Rosh Hashanah. And while I was in Krakow for Rosh Hashanah, I was like, you know what? I'm in Poland for the first time. Let's go check out the building. So I called my father, he gave me an address, and I went. I took a couple of trains, saw the building, had a kind of sentimental moment, and left. And I really didn't think I'd ever go back. But what happened was over the next few years, I ended up spending a lot of time in Poland. I met a lot of people, made a lot of friends. I was doing a lot of different work. And over time, I met more and more people who had been involved in property reclamation of their own. And my father sort of kept nudging me. He's like, with this building, we own it, we have these papers, you should take a look. And I sort of kept ignoring him. I was being very lazy. And finally, he got tired of my laziness and faxed me all the documents he had to a hotel in Krakow where I was staying. And that's where I really entered. When I read those pages, I really felt for the first time like I was meeting my grandfather. Because I saw there a sort of like a textured part of his personality, because I saw he had failed for over 30 years to reclaim his property. And in there was like a lot of, I was projecting, but you could see a lot of frustration. And I was lucky enough to be in a position where I could sort of pick up where he left off. And I was able to sort of resume this. And I really felt at that point, I was like, it feels like an interesting and potentially meaningful way to interact with my legacy.
So how do you start? I mean, you mentioned before you had to prove that your dead relatives were indeed dead, which sounds somewhat bizarre, but presumably there's a lot more to it than that.
Basically I sort of asked a local chassid for a lawyer recommendation. It's a good tip. If you're looking for a lawyer, ask your local chassid. And that he recommended a woman who I referred to only as the killer. And the killer was like a real old school lawyer, a woman, I think in her 80s. And so been doing law for a very long time. And that's all. I just went with all my documents. I said, here are my documents. Let's do this.
How did you feel when you saw the building? Did you feel any affinity, any emotion?
Yeah, when I started the process, I was under the impression that this was where my grandfather grew up, and so there's like the childhood home, and it's an apartment building. It's like 4 or 5 stories, maybe 20 units total. So I had no idea which apartment, but you're like, wow, this is where my grandfather grew up. What a meaningful and powerful thing. And then, how do we feel about spoilers?
Well, we don't want to spoil the book for people, but I'm interested. Did you actually knock on any doors? Did you meet some people who lived there?
I did. So after a couple years of going through the reclamation process, I ended up getting some pushback, some criticism from people in Poland and also at home in the U.S. that they accused me of doing something like appropriation, like I was appropriating property and taking property back. Taking property for myself. And the accusation made me very uncomfortable, made me very defensive, because the counterexample I would use is, suppose my family hadn't been murdered in the Holocaust. No one would dare sort of challenge my legal claim on the property. And so the fact that people were murdered means that what I'm doing is therefore wrong or morally suspect. And so, but yet, all this criticism that I encountered did move the needle. Now, I felt very strongly that my moral and legal claims were really never in question regarding the ownership, but it did sort of bring into my consciousness the fact that other people were living there. And it sounds kind of wild to say now, like how that I could have been so blind to that, but I had really just sort of assumed this very family-centric narrative. Like my family owned the building before the war, we still own the building. There's nothing else to talk about. But the fact is that there were people in the building who had no conception of the history of the property, had lived there perhaps their entire lives, had perhaps lived there multi-generationally. And so I felt it would have been an act of moral cowardice to at least not try to sort of interact with them to see how their narratives sort of merge with mine. So I kind of screwed up the courage and began knocking on doors.
Now, the second part of the book is called Risa. What is Risa, and how is this relevant to your story?
So Project Risa are a series of underground complexes built by the Nazis using mostly Jewish slave labor towards the end of the war. I'm saying underground complexes, but that really doesn't give you a sense of what these are. These were 7 quote-unquote tunnels that encircle a mountain called Owl Mountain that are enormous in scope. None of them are completed, but the ones closest to completion are humongous. We're talking square kilometers in area, ceilings 20 meters tall, rooms that could be 200 meters long. So these, multi-layered, basically, grids. So these were essentially subterranean neighborhoods. And they're sort of bewildering to behold. You walk into like a tunnel engineered by Nazis and hidden inside of a mountain. But what makes them truly enigmatic is that there is virtually no documentation as to what the Nazis were planning to do with them. And so Riza is sort of almost a mythical site in that part of the world.
And there's more than tunnels, isn't there? There are structures which give rise to conspiracy theories that they might have been used for anti-gravity aircraft and this kind of thing.
Yeah, so because there is no primary documentation, a real wild set of conspiracy theories has grown around these tunnels as to what their purpose was. And so some of the more colorful ones are, most of them have to do with the secret weapons of the Nazis. So you have stuff like anti-gravity, time travel, alien/occult communication devices, moon landings, lasers, nuclear weapons. All this stuff is, which we would consider pretty firmly in the sci-fi, but yet there's a pretty remarkably widespread belief in some of these conspiracy theories.
And how did you discover these? Did somebody show you them, or?
So what happened is in 2015, I'll take a step back and say within this sort of area, which is in Silesia, which is in southwest Poland, which used to be Germany before the war and was given to Poland after the war, there's a very large subculture of treasure hunters. Treasure hunters is a little bit of a misnomer, but it's a pretty significant and visible subculture, particularly that part of the country. So the numbers are usually estimated at over 100,000 people. And this includes, on one end of the spectrum, you have guys going out with metal detectors. And on the other end, you have very sophisticated and sometimes even sponsored expedition groups using high-end equipment like magnetometers or LiDAR or radar or drones or various excavatory machines. And that's the subculture of treasure hunters. How did I hear about them? In 2015, two of these so-called treasure hunters announced to the world that they had found something called the Golden Train. And the Golden Train is an ostensibly legendary train full of looted Nazi gold that, according to legend, was taken from Wrocław, holding something like 44 crates full of gold, hidden inside of the mountain adjacent to Riza, and was hidden there. And then for decades, people have been searching for it. This is like the holy grail of the treasure hunter community. And in 2015, two of these guys said they found it. And perhaps most remarkably is that for really interesting reasons, the entire world basically believed them. And there was just a massive international news story. You had the BBC, Fox, Sky, CNN, ABC, New York Times, the New Yorker, all sort of descended on the small town of Wałbrzych, where all this was happening. And that's how I heard about it. And so I read about it in one of these articles, and I was like, what? I've been spending a lot of time in that part of the world, and I never heard of anything. I never heard of treasure hunters or Riza, so I just got very, very curious.
And you met some of these treasure hunters.
So what I did is, at the time I was in graduate school writing fiction, and I was like, this would make a pretty interesting novel, I thought, or a set piece for a novel. And so I read through the articles, and there was one woman who kept getting cited as sort of the authority. Her name was Joanna Lamparska, and I wrote her a cold email. And she's like a historian, an author, and sort of treasure hunter herself, but someone very, very knowledgeable about the region and also about the community. And so I wrote to Joanna, I was like, look, I'm coming out. I'm interested in doing research. Would you kind of be my guide? And she said, sure. So I went for 2 days, and she sort of introduced me to the sites and to the people.
But this was, I suppose, quite significant that you were introduced to them, because there was a connection, an unexpected connection that you discovered.
So when they showed me the tunnels, and I met these treasure hunters, and it was like a really sort of bewildering couple of days. And then I was sitting with the treasure hunters after they had taken me to one of these tunnels, sort of sharing a beer, just sort of unwinding. And I was asking them all these softball questions, like, what have you guys found? What's your occupation? Where do you live? How did you get into this? And, they were giving me all these answers, and they're very macho. They're very, they're wearing camouflage. They're big, beefy guys with like thick mustaches and all these like military toys and equipment and Land Rovers, very macho. And so they were giving me all these sort of macho answers. And it was very interesting. But I had brought a photographer and another writer as part of my little group. And my writer friend, a very close friend named Maya, she asked a question that I wouldn't have had the chutzpah to ask. She said, this is all very cool. You guys are all very macho doing all this treasure hunting. But what about the fact that 14,000 Jews died digging these tunnels? Like, how does that figure into your narrative? How does that figure into your conception of these sites and of your activities surrounding these sites? And they got very, very defensive, and they started speaking very animated, very quickly in Polish, and I don't speak Polish. And so, they were speaking to Joanna, who's supposed to translate to me. But very quickly, their conversation outpaced the translation, and I just had to sit back and wait until Joanna was sort of explaining what they were talking about. But while I was just sort of spacing out, waiting for them to finish, I started hearing inside their conversation my last name, Kaiser, like little pings, like Kaiser, Kaiser. And they don't know my last name, so they weren't referring to me. So eventually I actually just stopped them. I said, "Who are you talking about?" And they said, "Abraham Kaiser." And the quote was, "One of the greatest people to have come out of the war, Jew or Pole," which is not a sentiment you hear very often from rural Poles. And they explained that Abraham Kaiser was a prisoner, a slave laborer on the Riza sites. And he had kept a secret diary, which was published after the war. He survived. The diary got published. And this text, because of the complete lack of information about Project Riza, has become, I would say, the primary text. And has become, even more than that, kind of a sacred text among the treasure hunter community. And Abraham has become something of a mythological figure. And so they explained this to me, and I was like, wow, what a story. Then later that day, I went to another one of the Riza sites, this one was built, much more built up. It's a tourist attraction. It's kind of like a state park. And they had a gift shop. And at the gift shop, they sold Abraham's memoir, like an updated, expanded version, published by the Museum of Gross Rosen. And I bought it. And, I couldn't read it. It was in Polish, but I bought it as a souvenir. I was like, look, it's funny. This crazy coincidence, Kaiser, Kaiser. And so, but that night I couldn't sleep. I was in a rented apartment in Wrocław. And I just was like flipping through this diary, and I took out, there was a preface written by museum researchers. And I saw that it contained all this biographical information. So I took out my phone and I scanned the text, I uploaded it, and I did a Google Translate. And they painted out the story, and they showed who Abraham's parents were and who his siblings were. And using that information, I was able to construct a family tree. And because I had documents from my property reclamation, and I plugged it into that, I built out this family tree and realized that not only were Abraham and I related, he was in fact my grandfather's closest surviving relative. And this is within my family, which we were under the impression that no relative survived, none of his siblings, aunts, uncles, cousins, many cousins. And then everything got very strange, and then the treasure hunter sort of picked up on what had happened. Word spread. And I was embraced as Abraham Kaiser's grandson. It wasn't quite true. I'm kind of actually his first cousin twice removed, but still. They sort of embraced me as his grandson, and I became a major celebrity, let's put it like that, among the treasure hunter community.
It's remarkable, absolutely remarkable. And has the book been published anywhere else outside of Poland?
Oh, the diary?
Yeah, the diary.
It was published, it's an interesting and pretty complicated question. It was published in Israel in the early 50s, a slightly different version, but that version has been sort of completely forgotten. You cannot find it. It took me 2 years to track down a copy, and even then I had to I'm not supposed to admit this, I sort of stole it from a library. But it's very, very difficult to track down. And so it's interesting when you consider legacies of books that the Hebrew one has died and the Polish one has been celebrated. And so I do spend a chapter sort of wrestling with that.
These conspiracy theories and this sort of alternative narrative, if you will, about the Nazi atrocities, do you think this has an impact on people's perceptions? Do you think it sort of maybe clouds their judgment of what happened?
Yeah, so to give you sort of my story, how I got into these, I started, hanging out with these treasure hunters. I didn't come as a conspiracy theory research. It wasn't my my field. It wasn't one I was particularly interested, but I started hanging out with these treasure hunters, and I started hearing again and again these like really wild things like Nazi UFOs and anti-gravity machines. And at first I dismissed it. You know, I was like, that's just silly, he's crazy. But then I realized how widespread and endemic these beliefs actually were, which really forces you to confront it. And you're saying, okay, if I'm here trying to figure out who these treasure hunters are and what are the sort of the beliefs and mores of the community, then I am forced to confront the conspiracy theories. And what is by far the most research-intensive chapter in the book, I spent like 6 months sort of actually plowing through these conspiracy theories. Hours and hours of videos, research. I hired a Polish research assistant to help me with the Polish material. And I think our initial reaction is wrong. I think we find these things very easy to dismiss because they're so laughable. You say things like Nazi UFOs, you're like, it's pretty funny. It's like a pretty wild and zany thing. It's like you don't think to take it seriously. But the thing that I felt more and more as I did more and more research was that there was a very, very pernicious underside to these, not necessarily the beliefs, but the system of the beliefs, as in because it reweights the narrative of the war. And so it de-emphasizes the dead, and it overemphasizes what they see as the protagonists, which are the Nazis. And so you see again and again that the main narrative of the war becomes anti-gravity as opposed to murder and genocide and suffering and wrongdoing. And you see, and in fact, there are a lot of Holocaust deniers either overlap or in fact started as conspiracy theorists. Wild ones, like one Ernst, I can't remember his name, one of the most prominent Holocaust deniers today, actually his first book was, I think, like Nazi bases in Antarctica. That was his sort of first foray. And so their objectives, I would say, converge, even if not everyone's fully conscious of it.
Now, you mentioned that 3 of your grandparents are survivors, Holocaust survivors, and you talk in the book about the Holocaust causing a rupture in familial inheritance. Tell us a bit more about that.
You know, so I come from an observant home, an Orthodox home, and which is sort of really informed by ritual. And so I don't even remember how I got to it in the book, but there's quite a long discussion about, you know, how ritual is passed down, right? Because I'm really trying to think about inheritance in a wider sense than just a property or an heirloom or something like that. As I would try, I have to consider sort of different other sorts of values that are passed down, whether they be sentimental or spiritual. And so I ended up having sort of my father confronted me at one point in my reclamation and saying like, I'm very happy that you're doing this building, but that's not what your grandfather would have cared most about. Your grandfather would much more cared about the tradition being properly inherited than property in Poland. And it was hard to hear, but I struggled with it, and I did understand his message. And it's like, this is another mode of inheritance, of spiritual inheritance. And then we, while researching, I came across these old family videos that showed my grandfather doing Havdalah with a ritual we had never seen before, where he dabs drops on his eyes and puts drops in his pockets. I think it signifies wisdom and
drops
wealth.
of wine.
Drops of wine from the Havdalah, from the cup of wine. And, we watched it, and, I showed it to my family, and my father's like, wow, I remember that. I remember that my father used to do that. And it was a really, moving moment, because this, like that rupture, which I was talking about, was about to be repaired. And he actually started doing this minhag that he had forgotten about for 40 years. And so, my father puts it, I think actually very touchingly, very powerfully. He said when he was a kid, he actually didn't know anyone with grandparents. He didn't have a conception of grandparents. All of his friends were the child of Holocaust survivors. And so that entire generation was cut off. And so we think about it in terms of like the human loss and the human tragedy, but also when we think about rituals and customs, so how many things weren't told or absorbed because of that? And in the book I call it a family's private Torah, and it was just sort of the accretion of like the weird quirks and customs and ways we approach tradition, and a lot of that was wiped out, and it's something you don't often confront.
So back to the property. Was the killer making making progress with your case? Because I think you were a little bit unsure whether the building was even old enough to have been your grandfather's home.
Yeah, so when I first walked into the building, it felt a little new to have been built, to have existed in the 30s, and I had some suspicions, but what did I know? Turned out I was in the wrong building. After 2 years spending time in this building and meeting the people, the inhabitants, investing quite a bit of at least emotional resources, turns out I was in the wrong building. It wasn't necessarily the killer's fault. I mean, maybe they could have gone and checked the records, but the addresses had shifted. And there was a typo from one of the property managers in the 60s, which just set me down the wrong path. So, and from there it just goes in fits and starts, like a legal process does.
So it's another building.
It's another building.
And did you knock on the doors there? And
No.
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 So your relationship with the real building seems very different to your relationship with the wrong one.
It's interesting. You asked me before. It was like, did I have a sentiment? Did I have And I was like, I did, but I invented it, which is interesting because it really sort of sheds light on our sentimental attachments to objects, in general. A lot of us have sort of things that were passed down from parents or grandparents. And what if you found out it was fake? So did your relationship to the object change? These are hard questions. So I just didn't have, I think it was an act of cowardice not to knock on that second building, which was the correct building. I don't think my sense of responsibility was any less, but to be totally blunt and honest, I just I didn't have it in me. I just was completely wiped. And I felt it was important to be honest about that.
So we're certainly not going to spoil the ending of the book in terms of what happens with the property, but you describe, as if it's not remarkable enough that you find this cousin who's the idol of the treasure hunters. You mention this chance encounter at Frankfurt Airport, which is equally remarkable. But I'm also interested how you discovered this. Right.
Okay, so what happened? Basically, I read this memoir. I had the memoir of Menachem Kaiser translated, and so I read it in in English, and it's a really remarkable book, but it's very constrained in what it reveals about Abraham. It starts in 1943 and it ends at liberation, and it has nothing before, nothing after, so you don't really get a sense of him. And in the end, the way Abraham survived is, he ran away from the concentration camp, in March or April of 45. He ran down the road, and in it he describes he meets a German woman. He doesn't say her name, and she freaks out, and he calms her down and persuades her to hide him in the basement. And he goes down. This is only a couple of paragraphs. He goes downstairs. He gets in a box meant for storing potatoes. She brings him food once a day, and then 2 paragraphs later, a Russian soldier opens the lid, shines a light in his eyes, and says, "You're free." And then the memoir basically ends. And so that's it, and you don't get any more. And the treasure hunters really approach the text, for the details about Riza. They're not really seeing it as insight into who Abraham was as a person. And so the more I sort of spent time with the treasure hunters meant the more time I spent with this sort of mythological version of Abraham, the more curious I got about who he actually was. And so I tracked down, he had a sister who escaped to ran to Israel before the war, and also a brother who ran to South America. But the sister, she had 2 daughters, one of whom was still alive, and a lot of their kids were around and had met Abraham. So I went to Israel, and I met with all of them, and it was really interesting, and they told me more about Abraham. And so, he had a wife and a child before the war. They were murdered in Auschwitz. And afterwards, he got married to another survivor, and it was a very terrible marriage. I think she was a paranoid schizophrenic, and but he didn't have any kids. And so, but they, while I was hanging out with these Israeli relatives, basically a new branch of my family, one of them mentioned that the woman who had saved them was in fact a righteous among the Gentiles. The honor accorded by Yad Vashem to non-Jews who had saved Jews during the war. And I didn't know that. And so I contacted Yad Vashem. They sent me all the documents that they had on Menachem Kaiser. And there it was. And so the woman's name was Gertrude Froelich, and then you could see the application, like that's all part of the file. And in the application was a phone number for Gertrude's son, Alexander. And so there was I got a German friend to call him, and a few months later I flew to Berlin to meet with the 3 children of Gertrude, the woman who saved him, who are all still alive and were alive during the war and who remembered Abraham.
Wow.
And so then the story of salvation kind of really opened up into something really extraordinary. And to me, this was maybe the biggest gift in sort of being able to write the story, was finding out this story underneath. And so I always had this question about Abraham's timeline, because the war ended in 1945, but he didn't immigrate to Israel until 48 or 49. I never understood what he was doing in Poland during that time. So what I learned was that Gertrude not only saved Abraham, but they in fact had a relationship. They were lovers and wanted to get married, but for political reasons couldn't. The ethnic Germans were expelled, and Abraham was not willing to go to Germany, and Gertrude was not willing to go to Israel. And so history sort of separated them again, but I found this like remarkable love story, very, very tragic. And when I sat with the children, who are all in their 80s, and I showed them the photo of Abraham, they looked at the photo and they addressed it, and they addressed him as father. They addressed him as a father figure. And Gertrude never remarried, and she kept a photo of Abraham on her wall for the rest of her life until 1999. And this was sort of being like stumbling into this whole tale was very, very special.
And I suppose even more remarkable is the epilogue to the book. Do we have time to talk about that a little bit?
I could say it very briefly.
Sure.
During my time in Krakow, you meet a lot of people, and so I met like a mission of like 200 and 250 people who were, mostly Americans who were coming to Poland who had roots in my area, in like Sosnowiec, Będzin, like Głębia, which is like where my family's from. So I was immediately very interested in them, and I met this one guy named, I call him Steve in the book, and Steve asked me what I was doing in Poland, and I was like, by then I had told the story many times. The book wasn't out yet. I was working on it. I was like, it's a long story, and treasure hunters, blah, blah, blah. He's like, oh, treasure hunters, I have a story for you. And he's like, my father-in-law, he lived in Będzin, which was the city, where Abraham's from, where right next to Sosnowiec. He's like, my father was a goldsmith, and right before he escaped, he took all of his gold, he melted it all down, and he made 10 golden eggs. And he took those eggs and he hid them inside an attic. And he never went back for them. And he drew me a map. And then Steve shows me this map, and it's a handwritten map by his father-in-law of where the eggs are in the attic. And you see like 2 windows, and it's like 2 bricks below the window. There's a photo of it in the book, actually. And Steve's like telling me about this. He's like, maybe I'll go knock. And I'm like, Steve, you have to go knock. I mean, come on. And then Steve's like, come with me. Let's do this. And so we did. And so we ended up going to this woman's house and knocking on the door, meeting her, and talking our way into the attic. And Steve has basically you have to sort of squirm. The attic was partitioned, so to get to the side where the eggs hopefully were, you have to squirm through a hole. And Steve had a bad knee, so he couldn't do it. So I did it. So I became sort of Steve, his messenger. And so I sat and I actually removed bricks from this woman's wall in the attic. So that's the epilogue.
So we won't spoil the ending. Now, if you have questions at home for Menachem, please put them in the Q&A now, and we will convey them to him. Tell me a bit about the research element of the book, because it's slightly unusual to research a memoir. What sort of things did you have to do? I suppose what was the most interesting part of your research?
I think there was the conspiracy theory research, which was actually tough. Like, it wasn't fun. It's like trying reading like a 400-page book about Nazi anti-gravity sounds fun in theory, maybe. It's not at all. And so that was very intensive. Some other stuff that I had to learn a lot about this region. And also when I learned about Gertrude, I learned about what happened after the war, which was something I did not know about. I believe it was the largest forced migration in history. or maybe in European history, I'm not sure, of like, I think it was like 1.5 million Germans were forced to leave that part of Poland. And so it's something I did not know about at all. And so it's something that, was not taught, wasn't taught. And I read a number of really remarkable, beautiful books, both nonfiction and fiction. So that was really part of the research. Learning about the legal system in Poland was very, very tough. It took me a long time to understand it. And while it was going on, in 2015, there was basically, a new government came to power and began a sort of attacking the judicial system and trying to overhaul it. And so I really had to learn what was what, just like how the system worked, what was exactly under attack, how the judiciary worked, the independence of the judiciary, how the political system basically functions, which is something I just never really had to do before. Then there's like family research. It's a good question. People don't often ask. I had to look, then it's about the text, about Abraham's memoir. I had to track down the Hebrew version, get that translated, track down all the sources. It's a lot. It ends up being a lot. And then it's just hanging out with treasure hunters, which is fun, but also kind of exhausting.
I can imagine. You mentioned that some of the books you read about these periods in history were fiction and some were non-fiction, and I suppose a book like this might have been written as a work of fiction.
My book.
Yeah, is that something you considered?
Yeah, and it's something I actually admit pretty openly in the book, that I sort of at times regret not having written as a novel, because in a novel you get to make the rules. And so basically my book is a series of errors and mistakes and frustrations, and nothing works out the way it was, and there's typos, and I did the wrong thing, and my lawyer filed the wrong motion, and I found out the wrong information, and I go to the wrong building, and it's just like a mounting series of frustrations. And I was also I was very sensitive to this question of moral authority. And I feel very strongly that I do not have the same moral authority that my grandfather would have had. And so I am sort of continuing in his footsteps, but I am not him, and I'm not barely a representative of him. And so that was something I really struggled with. In a novel, I could sort of skip that. I sort of make him the protagonist, not me, and that whole question of moral authority is gone. Ultimately, it's not supposed to be a novel. And I think, the book, to the extent it succeeds, I think it's because it embraces these uncertainties and it sort of rides these errors to a different kind of narrative. And it's not only about what happened, it's also about sort of like failing and sort of what emerges in this process of like continual failure.
It's remarkable in terms of the various themes it pulls in, and you certainly learn, certainly I learned a great deal of things I didn't know at the outset. We have a question here from Christopher Lawrence. Have you ever met and compared notes with Susan Faludi? Her recent book, In the Dark Room, deals with similar quests in Hungary.
So I'm familiar with the book. I have never met her. That is a really, really interesting book. And it's also interesting because there is a property at the center of that narrative, but it's not, the properties sort of become secondary to the relationship with her father. So that it was definitely a book. As soon as I began sort of planning this one or writing the book proposal, it was a book that was recommended to me as someone who's sort of approaching a memoir like within this genre from like a different, much more personal lens. And so, but I've never communicated with her.
Ian.
Yes, I've got two questions. Can I ask you two questions?
I think so, yeah.
First of all, one of my fields of research is Nazi-looted art.
Really?
And I just wondered if there was any suggestion these tunnels that you saw, these caves, etc., were ever intended for the artworks that the Nazis were stealing from all over, whichever country they conquered.
So in case our audience at home didn't hear, the question is, were these tunnels intended for the storage of Nazi-looted art?
So I will look. The conspiracy theories will touch everything. So there's certainly people who believe that some of the valuable art that has not been found is still in the tunnel somewhere. I think it's very unlikely. And from what I understand, most like the storage stuff got, in Frankfurt, Berlin, where the main cities were. I think there's another interesting question of art that was private. And so like art that was not necessarily looted, but was hidden by Germans who had to flee. And so they're still finding stuff, kind of interestingly, and that stuff there's like jewels that they turn up when people renovate a house. They'll find in their basement some pretty wild stuff about. But in terms of like the purpose of the tunnels, I've never seen any of like the more sober historical accounts say it had anything to do with art, but certainly I've heard conspiracy theories that touch on it.
The second question I wanted to ask, if I may, the gold. There were, of course, the Cassner's train going from Hungary with the gold of the Hungarian Jews.
Yeah.
A lot of the gold was never found. Again, was part of the conspiracy theory maybe that some of the Hungarian gold, Cassner's gold, ended up in any of these tunnels?
So I suppose the question is, did some of the Hungarian gold on the so-called gold train end up in these tunnels?
Yeah, it's funny because I'm starting another project now that touches upon a whole different conspiracy theory about the Hungarian gold. I've never seen anyone make a sort of a grand, a sort of universal theory of Nazi loot that would involve Hungarian gold moving to Riza. That would get really elaborate, and part of the idea is there's a very small window in which it could have happened. And look, it also didn't. And so, but they have like this window where it could have happened. I think for you would have to, I don't know. I wouldn't be shocked if somewhere out there has sort of quote unquote connected dots and made an even more elaborate theory, but I've never seen anyone do it. But I think that the whole Hungarian gold trade is really interesting because there really was a trade and there really was full of gold and the world knew about it and wrote about it, and a lot of it hasn't been recovered. And so it does give a weird amount. That's what one of the hard parts about these conspiracy theories is that, I mean, the history that surrounds it is so wild that it's sort of easy to believe in something as wild as as these tunnels, as some of the the Nazis did have a program to develop super weapons. I don't think they were doing anti-gravity. But it's pretty remarkable how credulous people can be when it comes to Nazis in general.
And do you think this is one of the motivations of these treasure hunters that they think they're going to find this train full of gold? I made that mistake in the beginning of sort of like seeing them as one unified mass. They're pretty diverse, and I think you have some guys who are just like out. They're kind of, maybe not that sober when it comes to history, and they're like, yeah, we're going to go find gold in the Nazi train. But I would say a lot of them are much more passionate and much more stable about it, and so they see themselves as sort of like amateur archaeologists in a way. And the examples I give, the sort of the counter examples are, I met a treasure hunter who found a concentration camp that had been wiped off the map. Really?
Yeah, and it was like something that we weren't sure where it was, and was something that there were no real historical records of. And he had spent like 5 or 10 years or something interviewing locals, going through documents, and he found like where the barracks had been. He took me out to a field and showed me the barracks. You have other guys who like produce maps that are used by museums all over the world. And so you do actually have, within this sort of mass of enthusiasm, you have some quality work being done. I think overall, the historians and archaeologists that I've met hate them. They hate the treasure hunters because they ruin stuff. They go in even when they're not supposed to. I'll also add that treasure hunting is a regulated activity in Poland. So you cannot go out, you're not supposed to go out with a metal detector without a permit. Like you got to apply, and especially you can't dig or drill or do any sort of what they call explorations. And anything you find in the ground by law belongs to the state. You get 10%, but it is illegal. Like if you find a coin in the ground, you can't keep it.
Now, you alluded to another project. You clearly have a great gift for storytelling. Is there another book in the pipeline?
Right now the main project is I'm hoping to do. I've been in talks to do a documentary, not about my book, but actually about the Golden Train, not the Hungarian one, the mythical one. And so, but it's not necessarily about the golden train as much as the reception of it. And it was just so wild how, again, everyone believed. And you had like these 3 months where the entire world media was like sort of based in this town of Wabrzech. And it was like an extraordinarily surreal few months. And so that project, yeah, that's been sort of cooking, marinating for a bit.
Sounds fascinating. Well, hopefully you can come and tell us all about it on some future occasion. Menachem, thank you so much for being our guest this evening. It's been really fascinating to speak to you.
Yeah, my pleasure.
I can heartily recommend Menachem's book. He really is a master storyteller. Now, if anybody at home wants to buy a copy, there is a link in the email you'll get tomorrow. But if you want a signed copy, if you go to the Milim website and click the donation button, it's $14.99 plus £3 postage, and put your address on the PayPal form. We'll get a signed copy to you. And if you're overseas, add £5 postage. So that's $14.99 for the book, £3 UK postage, £5 overseas postage, and we will refund any excess to you if there is any. Those of you here in our audience can buy copies, and I'm sure Menachem will sign them here for you. And to say thank you, Menachem, here is a book of some of my photographs. This is Magen David Adom, the Israeli ambulance service in action. Hope you'll enjoy that.
Thank you so much.
Now, just a few words about our forthcoming programme before we leave you. Next Monday, the 14th of March, our very own Ian Vellins, our prolific questioner this evening, is back at Milim for the third time. He's speaking about the life and works of the playwright Tom Stoppard. The following Monday, 21st of March, we have a real treat for you. Howard Jacobson is our guest to discuss his recently published memoir, Mother's Boy, A Writer's Beginnings, which is hilarious. On the 28th of March, we join forces with the Jewish Historical Society of England Leeds branch, and we present Dr. Chelsea Sambells talking about lesser-known legacies of the Nuremberg trials. Into April, we have Joshua Rubinstein addressing the last days of Stalin, and Pam Fox looking at the Jewish hotels and guest houses of Bournemouth. Please visit our website at milim.org.uk. Sign up to our newsletter and make sure you don't miss anything. All of our events are free, but you can make a small donation. There's a link in the chat now to help with the costs of supporting these webinars. It remains for me to thank our speaker, Menachem Kaiser, once again. Thank you so much, Menachem.
Yes.
And looking forward to seeing you all again as a future event. Until then, stay safe. See you soon.